So first, just let me thank Al-Mustafa for this opportunity to present my work, my recent work, and to all of you for being such attentive listeners and engaging interlocutors over the course of the past couple of weeks. So my talk is titled "Retrieving the Foundations of Islamic Modernism: Fazlur Rahman and Mohammad Mujtahid Shabistari." So with the rise of Islamism and Islamic postmodernism in contemporary Muslim thought, the intellectual movement of Islamic modernism appears to be in eclipse. Alongside mainstream clerics, the ulama, engaging in internal critique from within a traditional scholarly hierarchy, Islamists have attempted to articulate an acutely political vision of Islam based on a conceived return to the literal dictates of Islamic law. In response to their literalist certainty, Islamic postmodernists, operating largely within the Western Muslim diaspora, have built off of European theorists such as Foucault and Derrida to subjectivize, historicize, and generally destabilize normatively authoritative conceptions of law and religion. They wish to highlight the very modern quality of Islamist attempts to refashion the corpus of Islamic law into a totalizing moral political vision in the present. Islamic modernists, argue both the Islamists and the postmodernists, remain beholden to European colonial patterns of thinking that fuse and incorrectly essentialized Islam with self-satisfied foreign notions of philosophic and material progress.
Could you repeat that sentence, please?
Sure. Islamic modernists, argue both the Islamists and postmodernists, remain beholden to European colonial patterns of thinking which fuse and incorrectly essentialized Islam with self-satisfied foreign notions of philosophic and material progress. Scholars of modern Islamic thought such as Qasim Zaman have pointed to the structural parallels between the vision of the Islamists and the Islamic modernists. Both attempt to retrieve, recast, and occasionally reify the formative period of Islam for the purposes of advancing contemporary agendas. Yet Islamic modernism, while perhaps guilty of certain epistemic and teleological sins, is nevertheless important for the Islamic present. Its intellectual spirit is not only responsible for informing the creation of a modern Islamic state known as Pakistan, but for providing a respectfully and constructively critical voice within contemporary Iran. Modernist thought encouraging, quote, discursive notions of reason governed by the inner logic of the Quran, as Qasim Zaman put it, are nonetheless in accord with modern science. They encourage dynamic forms of jurisprudence and religious ideology which are profoundly beneficial for contemporary Islam. My paper will look at the Islamist modernist thought of Mujtahid Shabistari and Fazlur Rahman comparatively, with the hope of appreciating the unique dimensions of their respective visions of Islamic modernism. It will begin with general questions of hermeneutical philosophy, focusing most intently on their respective appropriations and criticisms of Hans-Georg Gadamer, the famous German philosopher of interpretation, who was writing in post-war, immediately after World War II in Germany. It will juxtapose Rahman's hermeneutics of historical rationality with Shabistari's hermeneutics of historical contingency and the destabilizing variability of language. The paper will continue by delineating their respective views of prophecy and the nature of the Quranic text, attempting to link Shabistari and Rahman's hermeneutic philosophy with their respective views on the relationship between religion, politics, and the status of Islamic law. Shabistari's modernism, a philosophy centered on the variability and uncertainty of a religious truth within a nonetheless authoritative sense of tradition, ultimately empowers the Islamic tradition to assimilate broader intellectual and political currents. So this was just a general, I started off with giving just a general picture of where Islamic modernism fits within the realm of modern Islamic thought. We're sort of in between postmodernists and Islamists. But, you have postmodernists, Islamists, ulama, and the modernists. So I just gave a little, it needs to be more in depth if I want to prepare this for publication, but I just gave a brief overview of the intellectual landscape. So I'll start here. This paper will look at the Islamic modernist thought of Mujtahid Shabistari and Fazlur Rahman comparatively, with the hope of appreciating the unique dimensions of their respective visions of Islamic modernism. It will begin with general questions of hermeneutic philosophy, focusing most intently on their respective appropriations and criticisms of Hans-Georg Gadamer, the famous German philosopher of interpretation. It will juxtapose Rahman's hermeneutics of historical rationality with Shabistari's hermeneutics of historical contingency and the destabilizing variability of language. The paper will continue by delineating their respective views of prophecy and the nature of the Quranic text, attempting to link Shabistari and Rahman's hermeneutic philosophy with their respective views on the relationship between religion, politics, and the status of Islamic law. Shabistari's modernism, a philosophy centered on the variability and uncertainty of religious truth within a nonetheless authoritative sense of tradition, ultimately empowers the Islamic tradition to assimilate broader intellectual and political currents emanating from both the West and from within Islam. Most importantly, it can allow the contemporary Muslim demand for human rights into Islam's discursive structure, while simultaneously allowing the tradition to remain recognizably Islamic. Rahman's confidence in the Islamic State to enforce a liberalized positivization of Islamic law, a stance rooted in his rationalist conception of Islamic theology, limits his ability to fashion an Islam sufficiently responsive to the exigencies posed by contemporary Muslim politics, such as human rights. While Rahman was writing before human rights became all the mode. When he was writing, it just started coming from the international organizations such as the UN. So it wasn't really his concern. His concern was the state, having a good state, Islamic state. While Rahman may represent Islamic modernism in its most influential statist form, the Islamic modernism propounded by Shabistari reflects the productive evolution of this school of thought against the backdrop of Islam's contemporary Islam's contentious relationship with the modern state. So some intellectual historical background. The contemporary Iranian context contains the most rigorous intellectual efforts to critically reflect on the structural foundations of the Islamic tradition. Intellectuals and jurists are constantly considering those theoretical elements, both internal and external, which have proven essential to preserving as well as loosening the boundaries of what is considered the Islamic tradition over the course of history. They also have the privilege of being first-hand witness to the practical effects of a state system that has codified and positivized Islamic law. Furthermore, this system has melded political and religious authority in the personhood of a supreme jurisconsult functioning as the state's supreme leader. Never before have an Islamic ideology and the exigencies of a specifically modern state been so intimately intertwined. The innovative and that's not a value judgment, by the way. It's just my perception of what's going on. It's not good or bad. But the innovative scholars in question in Iran are usually steeped in either the traditional Islamic legal sciences, such as Mohsen Kativar and Ayatollah Montazeri, or Western philosophy, such as Abdul Karim Soroush. Yet Mujtahid Shabistari is one of the few who has succeeded in bringing together these seemingly disparate traditions, West and Islamic, and we've heard about that encounter and sort of how to appropriate it effectively by Dr. Vazei, Dr. Vazei, the other day. His training in German religious hermeneutics, both Protestant and Catholic, have allowed him to deepen the interpretive potentialities inherent in the Quranic text and rethink the ways in which the Quranic authority emanating out of multiple Islamic sciences, such as law, jurisprudence, and classical theology, can help reconcile religious piety and secular citizenship. His earlier history as a staunch supporter of Khomeini's revolution and participation in its learned council affirms his intimate knowledge of the revolution's theoretical and practical underpinnings. His hermeneutics, this paper will argue, are uniquely suitable for an Islamic epistemology that organically assimilates the contemporary exegy of human rights into both the Quran and its prophetic origins. While understanding the paradigms put forth by scholars critical of the current government, such as Kadivar, while understanding the paradigms put forth by scholars critical of the current government, such as Kadivar and Soroush, are essential to understanding the breadth of post-Islamic intellectual thought in Iran, Shabastari builds upon both classical sources and Western impulses for his prescient critique. On the other hand, it is in the Indian subcontinent that one sees the flourishing of a different type of modernist discourse, one that in many ways anticipates the political, if not intellectual, reality that is seen in Iran. In a period that could be considered post-colonial and indeed pre-Islamist, following World War II, in the 50s and 60s mainly, before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, political elites and intellectuals in Pakistan were negotiating the boundaries and partnerships between Islam and the modern state, albeit without a mediating discourse of human rights, which would come much later, or the nationalist-infused socialism in vogue across the Arab world at the time. Their concern was creating the type of modern Muslim state capable of generating a new kind of Islamic man, capable of reconciling exigencies arising from both the secular enlightenment and the Quranic corpus. Unburdened by any recent history of Islamic statehood, they were confident the modern state could spearhead such an effort. This new man would be free from both the pernicious aspects of Western secularism and the rigidities of juristic Islamic orthodoxy dominated by spurious hadith and a form of Islamic law devoid of ijtihad advocated by the dominant Deobandi ulama which operate in India and Pakistan, and which the spirit of that Dr. Crow has talked about during our program quite eloquently. As Ali Usman Qasimi insightfully notes, quote, "What was implemented and promoted by the Pakistani power elite in the name of an Islamic state was an interface between twin approaches of a sacred state admitting human will and a sacred state admitting sacred will. Such an understanding of Islam allowed the envisioning of a state in which, at least theoretically, democracy, rights of minorities, sovereignty of the parliament, and flexibility of Islamic laws could be propagated." Qasimi proceeds to note that the Pakistani elite were seeking to establish an ideal Islamic state based on an opaque standard of successful state functioning and overall popular perception of the state's Islamic moral rectitude. They were not seeking guidance from the ulama or from the sunnah as to the composition of either the state apparatus or the corpus of law. Instead, they were infused with a specifically modernist Islamic spirit that they sought to uphold in the country's various early constitutions. In fact, Qasimi does point out that it is debatable as to whether their concerns were authentically Islamic or, on the other hand, simply politically instrumental. Despite the brutal colonial history, Pakistan's elites were heavily influenced by European ideals, and they aspired to create a polity capable of integrating itself into the international community. Yet uniting East and West Pakistan under the banner of Islam as the state religion was the only possible way to bind this nascent, geographically non-contiguous country together and meet the existential challenges emanating from Hindu India. Implementing the tenets of Islamic modernism through the apparatus of a Western state model seemed to be the ideal solution. Yet the type of Islamic modernism propagated by the elites had definitive native intellectual underpinnings. Such a modernist spirit did not merely mean the wanton selection from the Islamic tradition of those elements appearing compatible with the rationalistic spirit of Western culture. Instead, public intellectuals beginning in the late 19th century, such as Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Chirag Ali, began advocating an approach to the Islamic tradition which placed an emphasis on careful rational selection of hadith and viewing the Quranic text as an organic whole within an independently constituted rational ethical message. Named the Ahl al-Quran, they rejected extra Quranic texts as a source of legal authority, thereby infuriating the ulama and the traditionalists. Later, intellectuals would tread more cautiously. Fazlur Rahman was involved with one of the early institutional attempts in the young state to inculcate young citizens with this type of modernist Islam. The Khalifa Abdul Hakim Institute for Islamic Culture in Lahore was established in 1954, as Qasimi notes, to popularize a modernist interpretation of Islam and counteract extreme rightist and fundamentalist forces. While they did not go as far as the Ahl al-Quran in rejecting the authority of the Hadith outright in their conception of parliamentary legislation, they nonetheless wished for secular and traditional elements to be rationally melded together, as noted earlier in my talk, in the service of an ideal Islamic polity. Under Ayub Khan